What if your blood told a story no country wants to hear? You speak Turkic. You pray in Arabic. You live in the shadow of China's western deserts. Everything around you says you're Uyghur, a child of Central Asia. But inside your cells, there's a stranger, a whisper in your genes, from thousands of miles away. Because the DNA of the modern Uyghur doesn't match the flags or the languages. It breaks every rule. The paternal line, your father's line, traces to the European steppe. The maternal line, your mother's side, flows from ancient Siberia, not from Beijing, not even from the old Turkic homelands. This isn't a migration. It's a mystery. Because how did a people with faces shaped by two continents end up here? In the dust-buried crossroads of East and West. History tries to flatten them into a statistic, into a headline. But the genome doesn't obey maps. It holds memory like a wound, and what it reveals is uncomfortable. Uyghurs are not a single thread. They are a knot, twisted through empires, invasions, love, war, and something older, something buried. Because as scientists dug deeper, they found a silence in the sand, a place where the past hadn't rotted away. It had mummified. In the far reaches of the Tarim Basin, in China's deadliest desert, archaeologists uncovered something no one expected. A body, perfectly preserved. Blonde hair, long nose, woolen cloak, tattoos fading across sun-toughened skin. It looked European, but it was 4,000 years old. And it wasn't alone. The more they dug, the stranger it got. Rows of bodies, frozen in time, staring back with eyes that didn't belong to the East. They weren't Uyghur. They weren't Chinese. They weren't supposed to be there at all. But their blood still flows. So, if the Uyghur DNA doesn't begin in Central Asia, where does it begin? The answer lies beneath the desert, beneath salt-crusted graves and forgotten funeral rites, beneath centuries of sand. Because the Tarim mummies aren't just ancient. They are ancestral. And what they reveal will rewrite everything. But one face, one body, started it all. And she was the first clue. But clues don't stay buried forever. Because when they lifted her out of the sand, hair still braided, lips curled in silence, they didn't just uncover a body. They uncovered a contradiction. The beauty of Lulan looked like she'd stepped off a mural in Bronze Age Europe, but she had been resting for 4,000 years in the heart of Western China. And she wasn't an outlier. One by one, the desert gave up more of its dead, red-haired men with high cheekbones, tattooed women in felt boots, children wrapped in wool, eyes forever closed under the salt-crusted winds of the Taklamakan. Their graves? Canoe-shaped coffins, lined in reeds, buried under shifting dunes. Their presence? Impossible. Because this wasn't a trade hub. Not yet. This was before Buddhism, before Islam, before the Silk Road stitched Asia to Europe. So who were they? Every detail pointed west, the textiles, the burial rituals, even their physical traits. But the DNA told a stranger tale. They weren't Indo-European. They weren't Scythian or Tocharian or Saka. Not even close. Their genome came back as mostly ancient North Eurasian, an Ice Age ghost population, thought to be extinct, survivors of a frozen world that vanished 10,000 years ago. Yet here they were, thriving in oasis communities, farming, herding, burying their dead in boats that never touched water. And the rest of their DNA? A smaller piece from ancient Northeast Asia. A faint trace. Enough to suggest contact, but not collapse. They didn't just mix into the world around them. They held on. For centuries. A people out of time, genetically frozen in the desert heat. No language. No written record. No modern name. Just preserved skin. And a lineage no empire could claim. But this was only the beginning. Because what followed next wasn't a mystery. It was a transformation. A second wave. Louder. Sharper. And it didn't arrive in silence. It arrived on horseback. Not with words. Not with trade. But with wind in its lungs and iron in its hands. Before there were borders, before there were roads, there were riders. And they didn't come to conquer cities. They came to chase the sky. Nomads, chasing pasture, herding animals across mountains and valleys that didn't belong to any flag. They didn't call it the Silk Road, but they carved its bones. Step by step, hoof by hoof, for thousands of years. They weren't merchants. They were movers, of blood, of language, of memory. And wherever they passed, they left pieces of themselves. It was here, across the dry veins of Central Asia, that the first true collision began. Not of armies, but of ancestors. Some came from the west, Iranian farmers with soil-stained hands and sun-soaked skin. Others thundered down from the north, Bronze Age herders riding with Yamnaya fire in their bones. And then, there were those who had already been waiting, isolated, silent, the ancient desert dwellers of the Tarim, the ones whose DNA carried Ice Age whispers. And when these worlds met, something quiet, something eternal, began to happen. They mixed, not in a war, but in 1,000 dinners, marriages, births, and burials. They shared more than trade. They shared blood. And slowly, generation by generation, a new human tapestry was woven. This was the first great admixture wave, 3,750 years ago. And it didn't leave cities or monuments behind, just fingerprints. In the genomes of their children. They left no names, no kings, no history books, but they became the unnamed ancestors of nearly everyone who would come later. Uyghurs, Saka, Tokharians, Hazaras, even echoes in the faces of modern Iranians, Kazakhs, Tibetans. Their story is everywhere, and nowhere, because they didn't rule, they merged. But not everyone came to merge. The next arrival didn't want to blend. It wanted to claim, to redraw maps in blood, because the first empire to storm through this land didn't follow the winds. It followed orders. The riders of the Han didn't come with families. They came with flags. 2nd century BCE, the empire rises, and with it, a new kind of movement begins. Not organic, not slow, but planned, like a hammer striking dry earth. Over 100,000 men, soldiers, settlers, scouts, pushed into the west, into the Hushi corridor, into the gateway of Xinjiang. And what they brought left more than cities behind. They brought bloodlines. Paternal DNA from the Yellow River Valley suddenly floods the region. Y chromosomes from the east, now buried deep in Central Asian soil. But on the maternal side, the story changes. The women's genes stay local. Their roots stretch back to the desert, to the farmers, to the horse people before. This wasn't blending. This was imbalance. A forced union of empire and resistance. Because while the Han claimed the land, the people didn't disappear. They adapted. They resisted. They remembered. In stone, the empire carved its name. But in bodies and lineages, the past kept whispering. And that whisper still lives. Even now, Uyghur DNA carries the marks of that invasion. Not balanced, not gentle. A sharp insertion of one lineage over another. The state today calls it unity. One people, one nation, one story. But the genome says otherwise. It remembers the collision. It remembers who arrived and who endured. And somewhere in that uneasy silence, culture shifted. Not with swords, not with soldiers, but with something softer. A change that moved through cities like a shadow, subtle, slow, irreversible. Because after blood and conquest came a new voice. Not from horses, not from kings, from scrolls, from monks, from wandering pilgrims who carried words older than war itself. The next transformation wouldn't be written in blood. It would be written in scripture. Not by emperors, but by monks. Because after the swords were sheathed and the blood dried into soil, a different force moved into the desert. Language, but not the language of the Han. Not even Chinese. It was older, stranger, Indo-European, and it spoke through silence. In the Tarim Basin, in places where no water flowed, where the sun cracked stone, people were writing prayers, in a language that belonged thousands of kilometers west. Tokharian. It sounded nothing like Chinese, or Turkic, or Mongolic, and yet it bloomed in the middle of Central Asia. Kutcha, Turfan, cities that shouldn't have existed the way they did, glowing with Buddhist monasteries, Iranian rituals, and frescoes painted with blue-eyed monks. Scripts that looked Greek, carved into temple walls. Mantras written in alphabets that felt misplaced. This wasn't conquest. It was cultural fusion. Buddhism had arrived from India. Tocharian had arrived from somewhere else, and the desert, somehow, held both. But then came the test. Scientists hoped the ancient mummies, the blond-haired ones buried in boats, might be the ancestors of these Indo-European speakers. The logic made sense. The look matched. The timeline almost fit. But the DNA said no. The Tarim mummies weren't their parents. They weren't even cousins. There was no direct genetic line between those ancient bodies and the Tocharian-speaking monks who lit candles in cave temples. So where did the Tocharians come from? How did their language arrive without their blood? And how did it survive for centuries in a region that would one day be called East Turkestan? Tocharian lived, and then it died, on borrowed ground, spoken by mouths that no longer exist, like a ghost language, echoing off cave walls, then vanishing into sand. And just when the story felt settled, a quiet desert, a fading tongue, a new tribe thundered in. They didn't whisper. They rewrote everything, because they didn't just bring language. They brought identity. After the silence of the Tocharians, after the echo of a fading Indo-European voice, something new came roaring through the mountains. Not as a whisper, but a declaration. Turkic, fierce, nomadic, and hungry. The Uyghur Khaganate had fallen, shattered in the north. But its people didn't disappear. They moved. South, into the Tarim Basin, into the oases where Indo-European prayers still lingered in crumbling cave walls. And here something strange happened. The Uyghurs, these Turkic-speaking newcomers, didn't destroy what was there. They absorbed it. They didn't build cities from scratch. They moved into ones already layered with Buddhism, Iranic customs, and desert silk. They learned oasis farming, adopted local dress, buried their dead under unfamiliar stars, and slowly they became something else. A culture built for memory, but rewritten through necessity. They kept their Turkic language, but everything around it, the architecture, the food, even the rituals, came from people who were already there. This wasn't conquest. It was conversion. And the real twist? Genetics shows us that modern Uyghurs are not directly descended from those migrating Uyghur tribes. The Uyghurs, a separate group still living in China, are far closer to the original Turkic DNA. But the Uyghurs we know today, they are a blend, a living mosaic. They carry the genes of Tocharians, Saka, desert farmers, and Mongolic riders, all under a name they adopted, not inherited. Even their religion shifted. Buddhism faded. Islam took root. Mosques replaced monasteries. And Turkic names began to rise in the records. But the bodies, the blood, stayed mixed. Uyghur became more than ethnicity. It became an idea. And just when that idea began to solidify, a massive new force entered the scene. It didn't just ride across the land. It swallowed it. Because what came next wasn't a migration. It was a world empire. And it changed the genome forever. It wasn't a migration. It was a swallowing. The Mongols didn't knock at the door of history. They kicked it open. And what rushed in behind them wasn't just war. It was everyone. After the Uyghurs blended into the oasis cities, after Islam rewrote the soul of the Silk Road, a greater force arrived. One no city could resist. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer land. He moved people. On purpose. Entire families. Whole professions. Scholars, soldiers, weavers, architects, lifted from Persia, from India, from China, and scattered like seeds into the heart of Central Asia. And suddenly, the Silk Road wasn't just a trade route. It became the world's first true genetic marketplace. In cities like Kashgar, Samarkand, and Bokhara, you could hear 5 languages in a single market, taste 5 cultures in one meal, watch marriages bind together tribes that once called each other enemies. The Uyghurs didn't vanish in this storm. They adapted again, as they always had. They became the interpreters, the administrators, the bridge between empire and everyday. And in their DNA, something stunning began to appear. A second wave of admixture. This time, not male-dominated like the Han invasions. This time, both sides of a lineage changed, fathers and mothers, east and west. The genome cracked open again, reshaped by movement, but also by choice. No longer just conquest, but connection. Chinese blood mixed with Sogdian. Persian roots tangled with Indian branches. Uyghur faces began to reflect not just the past, but the empire itself. And for a moment in history, Central Asia wasn't just a place. It was a mirror, reflecting everyone. This wasn't dominance. This was fusion, the kind that left no single origin untouched. But fusion doesn't protect you. Not from the silence that follows. Not from the maps that forget. Because the next battle wouldn't be fought with swords. It would be fought with memory. And rewritten through power. Because just as the dust of the Mongol world began to settle, a quieter storm rose. Not in the streets, not in the temples, but in the labs. Underneath it all was a body. Frozen in time. Still wrapped in desert silence. One of the Tarim mummies. And suddenly, no one was allowed to touch it. Not anymore. Foreign researchers blocked. DNA testing halted. Burial sites locked down. No more digging. No more questions. As if the truth, lying just beneath the sand, had become dangerous. The Chinese state called it preservation, protection, respect for the past. But Uyghur activists saw something else. They saw an erasure. Because to them, those mummies weren't just archaeological remains. They were proof. Of roots. Of belonging. Of an identity older than the state. And if those mummies carried genes linked to modern Uyghurs, then the political ground beneath everyone's feet would crack. So the conflict moved from caves to courtrooms. From deserts to data. Who gets to define ancestry? Who decides which bones carry weight, and which ones must stay buried? Because now DNA isn't just science. It's power. A single mitochondrial sequence, a strand of code, could challenge an empire's narrative. A forgotten grave could give voice to a silenced people. And so, the past became forbidden. Sealed under glass. Behind fences. Beneath layers of state control. No more samples. No more stories. No more truth, unless approved. But the thing about DNA? You can't stop it. Not really. Because it's not just in the sand, it's in the skin. In the blood. In every breath of those still living today. And no matter how hard they try to silence it, the genome keeps talking. Keeps twisting the story. Keeps pulling on threads once thought lost. And in one corner of this ancient puzzle, one city, one family, one isolated region, a clue still lingers. A pattern in the genes. Something no one expected to survive. But it did. Something survived. Not in the tombs. Not in the scrolls. But in the living. Because while the mummies were sealed, and the past pushed into silence, the genome kept breathing. Inside Uyghur bodies today, the story continues. And it's not a simple one. Run the tests, and the numbers will confuse you. 30% West Eurasian. Sometimes more. Blue eyes in one valley. Olive skin in the next. Faces that shift from Central Asian plains to the edge of Europe in a single generation. The other 60-something%. East Asian. Deep roots. Strong ties. A history shaped by dynasties and deserts. But none of it is pure. And maybe that's the point. Because modern Uyghur DNA isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. Twisting through waves of migration, war, trade, love, exile. Layered with every empire that came. Every people who stayed. This isn't a melting pot. It's a mosaic. Each piece still visible. Each edge still sharp. The blond mummies. The Tocharian monks. The Han generals. The Sogdian merchants. The Mongol brides. The Persian doctors. The Turkic farmers. All of them, still here. Not just in memory, but in muscle. In hair strands. In jawlines and dialects, and the way an old woman sings a lullaby in a dialect no school teaches anymore. This isn't survival. It's reinvention. Because the Uyghur identity, the real one, the one you can't erase with border checkpoints or banned textbooks, is built to endure. It carries adaptation in its blood, resistance in its cells. A history that doesn't collapse under pressure, it multiplies. This is why the genome was sealed. Not because it was weak, but because it couldn't be controlled. And even now, as maps are redrawn and stories rewritten, the body remembers. But their story isn't over. It just went underground. And where it's hiding now may be the oldest riddle of all. Because bones can be buried, maps can be redrawn, languages can be lost in silence. But DNA? It remembers. Even when the stories are erased, the sequences stay. Like ghost ink, written beneath the skin. The Uyghur genome isn't just a history book, it's a secret archive, holding on to every moment no one thought would last. But here's the twist. Science is racing forward, faster than censorship, faster than fear. New tools, new tests, ancient samples speaking louder than ever. And with every decoded strand, another lie begins to crack. Because truth doesn't need permission to exist. It just needs time. And maybe that's the real power. Not of empire, not of religion, but of memory locked in flesh. So now the question turns to us. Can we protect what they tried to erase? Not with flags, not with protests, but with curiosity, with science, with stories. Because every living genome is a confession, and every forgotten people leaves fingerprints in the blood of the present. What if you're carrying a lineage you've never heard of? What if your face is shaped by someone who was never supposed to survive? What if your ancestors, like the Uyghurs, defied geography? Would you want to know? Would you listen to what your blood is still trying to tell you? Because this story, it doesn't end in Xinjiang. It flows west, through crumbling trade posts, through desert poetry, through a language no one speaks, but still shapes the lips of distant cousins. Next time, we follow the trail of the Sogdians, another vanished people, another erased empire, but their genes still whisper,